Walk down any old street in York, in Bristol, in Norwich, in Gloucester, and if you know what to look for, you will see them. They are doors, perfectly ordinary doors in almost every respect. Wooden frames, iron hinges, sometimes a lintel, sometimes a small decorative arch above. They sit flush in the brickwork, just as every other door on the street sits flush in the brickwork. The proportions are right. The craftsmanship is often fine, sometimes exceptional. In other circumstances, on other buildings, you would walk past them without a second thought. Except for one thing. They are 3 meters off the ground, sometimes higher, sometimes a full story above street level. And there is nothing below them. No steps leading up, no platform, no balcony, no ledge. Just a sheer drop straight down to the pavement, and then the door, sitting in the wall as though someone fully expected to walk through it at any moment, and simply could not work out why nobody ever did. They appear in cities all across Britain. They appear on the sides of former warehouses and on the gable ends of old merchant houses. They appear overlooking canals and rivers, facing busy commercial streets, tucked into the back alleys of old market towns. Some of them are still fitted with their original ironwork. Some have clearly been opened and closed thousands of times in their working lives, the hinges worn smooth, the wood darkened by generations of hands. But nobody is explaining what they were for. Ask the local council. They will send you to the Heritage Department. Ask the Heritage Department, and they will send you to the County Records Office. Ask the County Records Office, and they will hand you a folder of planning applications from 1987 and suggest you try the museum. Ask the museum, and the volunteer on the front desk will think about it for a moment and then tell you they are probably for loading goods. Which is true, as far as it goes. It does not go very far, because these are not simply loading doors. Or rather, some of them are, and some of them are, something else entirely, and the question of which is which has never been fully answered. Because the full answer requires you to know something about how British cities actually developed, how streets changed, height over centuries, how floods shaped, which parts of which townspeople chose to build in, and how high they chose to build, how the wool trade, and then the cotton trade, and then the canal trade, and then the railway freight trade each demanded their own specific kind of door, their own specific height from the ground, their own specific relationship with the structure above and the street below. It requires you to know about the Great Fire and what it changed about how buildings were built. It requires you to know about the medieval practice of jettying, where upper floors hung out over the street, and how that affected where doors ended up relative to ground level. It requires you to know about the gradual silting of riverbeds and the consequent rising of floodplains, and how that changed where the dangerous waterline was, generation by generation, over hundreds of years. Nobody will tell you any of this, not in any organized, comprehensive way. The information exists, buried in academic papers and obscure local history pamphlets and the corners of architectural surveys that were written for audiences who were assumed to already know the context. The rest of us walk past the doors and wonder, and nobody joins the dots. Until now. This is the story of every British city's doors 3 meters off the ground. What they were for, who built them, why they are at exactly that height, and why, despite the fact that they are absolutely everywhere, visible to anyone who walks through an old British city with their eyes open. The full explanation has never been assembled in one place and told from beginning to end. Pay attention, because this is genuinely one of the most illuminating things you can know about how British cities were built and how they changed, and the answer is stranger and more interesting than you probably expect. If you have ever walked through an old British city and noticed something that did not quite make sense, a door in the wrong place, a staircase that ends at a wall, a window that looks out onto nothing, subscribe now and hit the bell. We find the questions that the official explanations skip over. This one has been sitting in plain sight for centuries. Before we can explain why the doors are there, we need to establish exactly what we are talking about. Britain has several distinct types of elevated doorway, and they have been lumped together in the popular imagination in ways that obscure rather than illuminate their individual histories. Treating them as a single phenomenon is a bit like looking at every elevated structure in a city and concluding they are all there for the same reason. Some of them are, most of them are not. The first type, and the most immediately recognizable, is the warehouse loading door. These appear on the upper floors of former commercial and industrial warehouses, and they served a simple and obvious mechanical function. Goods needed to be raised from street level to the upper stories of the building for storage, and then lowered back down again when they were needed. The loading door was where the goods went in and out. Above it, or built into the structure of the wall above it, you will often find a wooden or iron beam jutting out horizontally from the building. This is called a loading beam or a hoist beam, and a block and tackle system was attached to it, allowing heavy sacks or barrels or bales to be lifted directly from a cart below and swung through the loading door into the storage floor above. This system was more practical than carrying heavy goods up internal staircases, which were typically narrow and steep in warehouse buildings, and it remained the standard method of loading multi-story warehouses from the 17th century right through to the early 20th century, when mechanized lifts began to replace it. These loading doors are extremely common in cities with significant pre-20th century commercial histories. You find them in Bristol, along the harbour side, in Liverpool, around the rope walks area, and the old dock warehouses, in Manchester, in the northern quarter, and along the Rochdale Canal, in Leeds, in the Coles area, and around Granary Wharf, in Norwich, along Elm Hill and King Street, in York, along the River Ouse. They appear in almost every market town in England that had a significant agricultural trade, because farm produce, grain, wool, hides, cheese, needed to be stored in bulk, and bulk storage required upper floors with good access. The second type is less well documented and considerably less well understood, the flood door. These are elevated doorways built into buildings that stood in flood-prone areas, positioned above the expected high water mark to allow access to the building even when the ground floor was inundated. They are most common in cities built on or near rivers, York, Gloucester, Tewkesbury, Shrewsbury, Beverley, and they often appear on buildings that stood at the edge of the historical floodplain. The logic is straightforward. If you know your ground floor is going to flood every few years, you build your important entrance above the floodline, add a wooden staircase or external ladder to reach it in normal times, and accept that when the waters rise, you will access your building by boat and enter through the first floor rather than the ground floor. The third type is the result of what happens when street levels change. This is perhaps the least intuitive of the three, but it accounts for a surprising number of the elevated doorways you encounter in old British cities. Streets are not static. Over centuries, they rise. Rubbish accumulates and is not always cleared. Flood deposits lay down thin layers of silt year after year. Road surfaces are repaired and resurfaced, each layer adding a few centimeters to the height. The cumulative effect over hundreds of years is significant. A doorway that was at street level in the 13th century may be a metre or more above street level by the 18th century, and substantially above street level by the 21st century. In some British cities, the change in street level has been dramatic enough to be clearly visible. In Edinburgh, the medieval old town sits on a ridge above what were once boggy valleys, and the construction of the new town and the bridging of the valleys in the 18th century fundamentally changed the geography of the city. In York, medieval street deposits have raised the ground level in some areas by several metres compared to the Roman and early medieval surface. In Bristol, the creation of the floating harbour in the early 19th century changed the relationship between the city's streets and its waterfront in ways that left some buildings with their original access arrangements looking entirely incongruous. The fourth type, less common but worth mentioning, is the result of deliberate architectural choices made for reasons that have nothing to do with flooding or loading. Medieval and early modern buildings frequently had external staircases leading to upper floor entrances, particularly in urban settings where the ground floor was used for commercial purposes, a shop or workshop, and the upper floors were residential. The external staircase was demolished at some point, usually because it was taking up valuable space on a busy street, and the door it served was sealed, or not sealed, but simply left in place 3 or 4 meters off the ground with nothing to reach it. All four types are found in all British cities with significant pre-industrial histories. They overlap geographically, they sometimes overlap on the same building, and they are frequently confused with one another by the guides and heritage plaques that are supposed to explain them. The loading door gets mistaken for the flood door. The elevated residential entrance gets identified as a loading feature. The result is a general muddiness about what these buildings actually were and why their doors are where their doors are. To understand the truth, we need to go back much further than the Industrial Revolution warehouses that most people think of when they see a loading door. We need to go back to the medieval period, to the way towns first developed in Britain, and to the specific economic and environmental pressures that shaped the buildings in which these doors first appeared. The story of elevated doorways in British cities begins, as so many stories about British cities begin, in the medieval wool trade. Wool was the foundation of the English economy for the better part of 500 years. From roughly the 11th century to the late 15th century, raw wool and then finished woolen cloth were the dominant English exports, the basis of royal taxation, the source of merchant fortunes, and the physical substance from which a remarkable proportion of the built environment of medieval England was constructed. The great perpendicular churches of East Anglia, the merchant houses of the Cotswolds, the guild halls of the wool towns, all of it built with wool money, all of it testimony to the extraordinary wealth generated by a trade in an animal byproduct that England happened to produce in exceptional quality and exceptional quantity. The wool trade required storage. Large quantities of raw wool, collected from farms across a wide geographic area, had to be gathered in one place before being exported. Finished cloth, dyed and woven by urban artisans, had to be held in merchant hands while prices were negotiated and ships arranged. The physical infrastructure of this trade, the warehouses, the wool halls, the cloth halls, the merchant houses with their internal storage capacity, survives in fragments all across England, and the elevated doorways that served these buildings are among the most visible fragments. Consider what a medieval wool merchant's warehouse actually needed to do. Raw wool came in as fleeces, which were bulky, smelly, and vulnerable to damp. A single bale of compressed wool could weigh 100 kilograms. A shipment worth carrying to the coast might involve hundreds of bales. These could not simply be piled on the ground floor of a building in a town where the streets flooded periodically and where rats and damp and fire were constant threats. They needed to be stored high, dry, and accessible for rapid loading when a ship's sailing schedule made urgent movement necessary. The solution, which appeared independently in trading cities across northern Europe and was not unique to England, was the multi-story warehouse with a loading hatch or loading door on the upper floors and a mechanical system for raising and lowering goods. In the Dutch and Flemish cities with which English merchants traded most intensively, Bruges, Antwerp, Amsterdam, this building type was so well established by the 13th century that it had its own architectural conventions and its own name, the parkhuis, or warehouse. The English merchants who traded in these cities, and the Flemish and Dutch merchants who came to England to trade, brought this building type with them when they built their premises in English towns. The earliest surviving examples of this building type in England date from the 14th and 15th centuries, and they cluster, unsurprisingly, in the wool and cloth trading towns, Lavenham and Long Melford in Suffolk, the great cloth hall towns of the West Riding, the Cotswold wool towns of Chipping Campden and Burford and Cirencester, the coastal towns from which wool was exported, Boston in Lincolnshire, which was briefly the most important wool export port in England, King's Lynn in Norfolk, Southampton, and Bristol and Hull. In all these places, if you know where to look, you can find buildings whose original loading arrangements survive in some form, whether as intact loading doors, as blocked-up openings that were once loading hatches, or as the ghost of a loading beam visible in the timber framing of a gable end. The height at which these doors were placed was not arbitrary. It was determined by two intersecting factors: the height of the carts that were to be loaded and unloaded beneath them, and the height above ground at which the goods needed to be stored to avoid the worst effects of ground floor damp. Medieval carts were tall vehicles by modern standards. The wheels of a heavy goods cart in the medieval period were large, a metre or more in diameter, because large wheels distribute weight more evenly and roll more easily over unpaved surfaces. The cart bed sat above the wheel axle, adding another half-metre or so. A standard medieval goods cart would have its bed at roughly a metre to a metre and a half above ground level, to allow a worker standing on the cart to reach a loading door directly, to swing a bale or a sack through the door without raising it any higher than necessary. The loading door needed to be placed at roughly the height of the cart bed, plus the height of a standing person, plus a comfortable working margin. Do the arithmetic, and you arrive at approximately 3 to 4 meters above ground level. This is why so many elevated doors in British cities are at approximately the same height. It is not a coincidence. It is the result of a specific technological constraint, the height of horse-drawn goods carts, that remained essentially unchanged for roughly 500 years from the medieval period until the 19th century, when wheeled vehicles began to change significantly. There is a further factor that reinforced this height. Ground floor damp in the medieval period was not simply an inconvenience, it was a serious threat to valuable goods. Wool that absorbed moisture would rot. Grain that sat on damp floors would mold. The first floor of a warehouse, typically accessible only by internal ladder or steep staircase from the ground floor below, was drier, cooler in summer, and warmer in winter than the ground floor. It was the preferred storage space. Putting the loading door on the first floor, at the right height for cart-level loading, gave merchants the best of both worlds. Convenient access from the street and the better preservation conditions of elevated storage. These practical calculations were made independently, repeatedly, by merchants and builders across a wide geographic area, and they converged on approximately the same answer each time. The answer is the 3-meter door. It appears because the carts were a certain height, the first floor was a certain height, and the calculation came out the same way in Norwich as it did in Bristol, as it did in York, as it did in every other town in England where merchants stored valuable goods. This is the baseline explanation, the foundation of the story. But it is not the whole story, and in some cities, it is barely even the beginning. York is, in the opinion of anyone who has studied the history of elevated doorways in British cities, the single most instructive place in England to look at this question. It is also, perhaps not coincidentally, one of the most flood-prone cities in England, and has been for its entire recorded history. The city sits at the confluence of the rivers Ouse and Foss, in a broad vale that drains a substantial portion of North Yorkshire. The Ouse, in particular, is a powerful river that drains an enormous catchment area, including the rivers Swale, Ure, and Nid, all of which converge upstream of York. When significant rainfall events occur across that catchment, which happens with some regularity, particularly in autumn and winter, the water arriving at York has nowhere to go except across the floodplain on which parts of the city are built. This has been true since the Romans established their military garrison at Eboracum in the 1st century AD, and it was true long before that. The Romans built their fortress on higher ground above the river, which tells you something about what they thought of the flood risk. But the city that grew up around and beyond the fortress was not always so careful. As the medieval city expanded, it expanded in every direction, including onto the low-lying ground close to the rivers where flood events were a predictable fact of life, rather than an occasional surprise. The consequences are visible throughout York's built environment to this day. Walk down Skeldergate or King's Staithe, the old quayside streets along the south bank of the Ouse, and you will see buildings with flood marks on their walls, installed by the city in the early 20th century to record the height of historical flood events. The marks start well above knee height, and some of them are above head height. These are not anomalous extreme events. They are regular occurrences recorded over decades and centuries of residence in a flood-prone city. The buildings that line these streets, and the streets immediately behind them, show every adaptive strategy that medieval and early modern builders developed in response to the flood problem. Some buildings have raised ground floors, with the floor level of the room accessed by the front door several steps above street level, creating a small moat of clear air between the front of the building and the ground that reduces the rate at which floodwater enters the interior. Some buildings have clearly been raised at some point in their history, with original windows now lower than would be expected, suggesting that the ground floor was at some point reconstructed or extended upward. And some buildings have elevated side doors, access points on the upper floors or on the secondary facade away from the main street, positioned at a height that would remain above water during a significant flood event. These flood doors are not identical to loading doors in their physical appearance, though they are sometimes confused with them. A loading door is typically large, wide enough, and tall enough to admit a bale of wool or a barrel of goods, and it is usually positioned on the gable end of the building, facing toward the street, directly above the area where carts would have stood. A flood door is typically narrower, wide enough to admit a person comfortably, wide enough perhaps to admit a small package of documents or valuables, and it is positioned wherever is most convenient for access by boat when the ground floor is submerged. The logic of the flood door becomes very clear when you think about what a flood actually does to a building and how the people inside it need to behave. The ground floor of the building becomes inaccessible. The furniture and possessions stored on the ground floor, if they have not been moved in time, are damaged or destroyed. The residents or workers in the building retreat upward. They need to maintain communication with the outside world, receive food and fresh water, move documents and valuables in and out, and eventually be evacuated when the flood recedes sufficiently. A door on the upper floor, above the flood line, positioned over the water that now fills the street, is the most practical solution to all of these requirements. In York, the locations of flood doors correlate almost exactly with the historical floodplain boundaries, which have been mapped by archaeologists and flood historians working from a combination of historical accounts, physical evidence in buildings, and scientific analysis of flood deposits. Buildings outside the floodplain do not have flood doors, or at least not positioned at floodline height. Buildings inside the floodplain frequently do. The correlation is close enough to constitute strong evidence for the flood door interpretation, rather than the loading door interpretation that is sometimes applied to these features indiscriminately. But here, the story becomes more complicated in an instructive way, because the floodline, the height above which a building's primary access needed to be positioned to survive regular flood events, was not constant over time. It changed, and it changed in ways that are not always obvious from casual observation. The primary mechanism of change was the gradual raising of the bed of the river Ouse. Like all rivers, the Ouse carries a sediment load, sand, silt, clay particles suspended in the water, that settles when the flow slows. In a wide, low-gradient river like the lower Ouse, significant deposition occurs continuously, raising the riverbed millimeter by millimeter over centuries. The effect, accumulated over the 12 centuries since York was first substantially settled as a medieval town, is significant. The riverbed in the centre of York is substantially higher, relative to sea level, than it was in the early medieval period. A higher riverbed means a higher water level for any given discharge. It means floods that would previously have overtopped the riverbank only in extreme events now overtop it in moderate events. It means that the floodline height, the height to which floodwaters regularly rise, gradually increases over time. And it means that buildings which were originally safe from flooding, because their ground floors were above the floodline, as it stood when they were built, gradually become vulnerable as the floodline rises toward them. This process is why some elevated doors in York are higher than others. A building that was constructed in the 15th century and has remained essentially unchanged may have its flood door at a height that corresponds to the floodline as it stood in the 15th century. A building that was modified or reconstructed in the 18th century may have its elevated access at a height corresponding to the higher floodline of that period. The variations in door height across a single street, or even across a single block of buildings, encode a history of flood risk change that would be invisible if you were simply looking at the doors as architectural features. There is one further complication. As the floodplain of the Ouse has changed over centuries, so has the response of the city's residents to the flood risk. In the early medieval period, when York's merchant community was smaller and the tools available for flood management were limited, the response was primarily adaptive. Build higher, keep the important things off the ground floor, and accept that flooding was a periodic inconvenience. But by the 18th and 19th centuries, as the city grew and the economic costs of repeated flooding became more serious, a more active management approach developed, involving embankments, flood walls, and eventually the 19th century drainage and sewerage works that fundamentally changed the city's relationship with its rivers. These interventions, paradoxically, often increased the height of elevated doors rather than reducing it. An embankment that prevents the river from spreading across its floodplain does not reduce the flood risk for buildings close to the river. It concentrates it. The water that used to spread across a wide area now rises faster and higher in the narrow channel above the embankment. Buildings immediately riverside of an embankment, which used to flood only when the river rose above floodplain level, now flood when the river rises above embankment height, which may be considerably higher. The response in building terms was to raise the floor level, raise the critical access points, raise the flood threshold, to escalate the door height in step with the escalating flood risk. Walk along King's Staithe in York today, and you are walking through several centuries of this escalation, visible in the varying heights of elevated doors and raised entrances. The lowest examples date from before the first significant riverside embankments. The highest examples date from after the major 19th century flood management works. The street is, in this sense, a physical archive of flood risk history, if you know how to read it. The same pattern, in different local variations, appears in every British river city that experienced both a significant pre-industrial commercial history and a significant flood problem. Bristol, Gloucester, Shrewsbury, Beverley, Peterborough, King's Lynn, all of them have buildings with elevated doorways that make full sense only when you understand the specific flood history of that particular stretch of riverbank, in that particular city, at the time when that particular building was constructed. This is why the official explanations are so unsatisfying. A plaque that says simply loading door or flood door is not wrong, exactly, but it is stripping away everything that makes the door interesting. The specific calculation of the specific height, the relationship with the local flood history, the evidence of how that flood history changed over time. The door is not just a door, it is a measurement. It is the answer to a question that the builders were asking about their specific, local, historical situation, and to understand the answer, you need to understand the question. To understand the wool trade's contribution to Britain's landscape of elevated doors, you need to understand something about the geography of the medieval wool trade that is not always appreciated. It was not concentrated in one place. It was spread across the entire country, from the Cotswolds to the Yorkshire Dales, to the Welsh borders, to East Anglia, and the towns that served it. The market towns where wool was collected, graded, and stored before being sent to the coast for export, were not the great medieval cities. They were the medium-sized provincial towns that most people today would not immediately associate with great wealth or great historical significance. Lavenham in Suffolk was, in the 15th century, one of the wealthiest towns in England. This seems almost impossible when you look at it today. A village of a few thousand people, built around a church that is far too grand for the community it serves, with a marketplace that feels cavernously oversized for the activity it now hosts. But the size of the church and the size of the marketplace are testimony to what the place once was, a centre of the Suffolk broadcloth trade, whose merchants in the late 15th century were wealthy enough to rebuild their parish church in the Perpendicular style, to commission elaborate timber-framed guild halls, and to build merchant houses that still stand today, 5 and 6 centuries later, recognizable in their essential structure, despite all the subsequent alterations. The merchant houses of Lavenham and of Long Melford just down the road, and of Kersey and Hadley and Clare and the other cloth towns of the Suffolk wool country are remarkable survivals of a building type that has been lost or obscured in most other parts of England. They are large, substantially built, often 3 stories high, and they were designed from the ground up to incorporate the storage and processing functions of the cloth trade. The ground floor of a typical Lavenham merchant house might contain a shop or a counting room facing the street, a workshop or a weaving room behind it, and storage space beneath. The upper floors were residential, but they were also where the merchant's stock of cloth was kept, dry, accessible, and protected from the street-level damp. The relationship between these buildings and elevated access is visible in the way the buildings are oriented and the way their doorways are positioned. Many Lavenham merchant houses have loading arrangements on their side or rear facades rather than their street fronts. This is because the street facade was commercial space. The shop, the counting room, the face presented to customers and competitors, while the loading function was a working function, best located where carts could maneuver without disrupting street traffic. A loading door on the side alley or the rear yard of a merchant house, opening onto the second or third floor of the building, where the cloth stock was kept, served the working requirements of the business without compromising the commercial presentation of the street front. This arrangement, loading access at the side or rear, commercial presentation at the front, was not unique to Lavenham. It appears in the merchant quarters of every significant medieval trading town in England, and it explains why elevated doorways are sometimes found in unexpected places. Not on the main street, but around the corner, in the alley, on the back elevation that most visitors never see. The wool towns of the Cotswolds show a slightly different version of the same pattern. Here, the topography is more dramatic. Steep hillsides, narrow valleys, fast-flowing streams that powered fulling mills, and the architecture reflects it. Chipping Campden's Church Street is perhaps the best preserved medieval wool merchant streetscape in England, a sequence of buildings that still reads clearly as a prosperous wool town high street. The Greville House, built in the late 14th century for the wool merchant William Greville, is a particularly clear example. A substantial stone-built merchant house with a ground floor designed for commerce and upper floors for storage and residence, and external evidence of the loading arrangements that served it. The Cotswold buildings tend to be built in the local limestone rather than the timber framing of East Anglia, and the limestone construction gives them a permanence and robustness that has preserved more original fabric than survives in the comparable timber-framed towns. The loading arrangements in Cotswold wool merchant houses are often more clearly visible because the stone construction required less alteration over the centuries than timber framing, which was more vulnerable to rot and more frequently replaced or upgraded. But the principle is the same. The door is at the height it is because of the carts. The carts were at the height they were because of the roads and the loads, and the roads and the loads were what they were because of the wool trade, which was what it was because medieval England happened to produce the best wool in northern Europe, and the merchants who traded it happened to need buildings that could store large quantities of a valuable but bulky commodity in the most efficient and practical way available to them. The wool trade went into decline in the later 15th century as competition from continental cloth makers and changes in European fashion reduced the premium commanded by English raw wool. But the buildings it left behind did not disappear. They were adapted. The loading doors that had been designed for wool bales were repurposed for grain. The merchant houses became farmhouses or inns. The cloth halls became the civic buildings or market halls. And the elevated doorways, practical, well-built, designed to last, remained where they had been placed, 3 or 4 meters off the ground, waiting for someone to ask why. By the time the Industrial Revolution began in the 18th century, the loading door as a building type had been established in English commercial architecture for over 300 years. The industrial warehouses of Manchester and Liverpool and Leeds did not invent the elevated loading door. They inherited it, scaled it up, and applied it to new materials and new goods. Understanding the Industrial Revolution warehouses requires understanding what came before them. The Industrial Revolution transformed the loading door from a feature of individual merchant houses and small commercial warehouses into one of the defining architectural elements of the British urban landscape. The scale change was staggering. A medieval wool merchant's warehouse might store a few hundred bales of wool, weighing perhaps 20 or 30 tons in total. A Manchester cotton warehouse of the 1820s or 1830s might store 10,000 bales of raw cotton, weighing over 1,000 tons, on multiple floors connected by a mechanical hoist system capable of moving hundreds of kilograms at a time. The same basic principle, goods raised to upper floors through a door in the wall, using a mechanical lifting system attached to the facade of the building, was operating at a completely different scale, in buildings of completely different size, handling completely different materials, but doing so in a way that would have been immediately comprehensible to a medieval wool merchant who had used exactly the same arrangement, if much smaller, in his Cotswold market town 500 years earlier. The geography of this transformation is instructive. The great industrial cities that became synonymous with the Victorian manufacturing economy were not, for the most part, the great medieval cities. Manchester had been a minor market town in the medieval period, vastly overshadowed by Chester and York in importance. Liverpool had barely existed as a significant settlement before the late 17th century. Leeds had been a prosperous market town, but nothing compared to the wool towns of the West Riding. What transformed these places into the most important industrial cities in the world was the convergence of specific resources and technologies at a specific historical moment. Coal, water power, cotton, iron, and then steam, and the construction, at extraordinary speed, of the physical infrastructure to support the new industries. That infrastructure included warehouses, enormous numbers of warehouses, serving the enormous quantities of goods that flowed through the new industrial economy. Cotton arrived as raw material from the American South and from Egypt and India, was processed in the mills of Lancashire, and left as finished cloth for markets around the world. Wool arrived from Australia and South America, was processed in the mills of the West Riding, and left as finished cloth for the domestic and export markets. Coal moved from the mining districts to the industrial centres. Iron moved from the foundries to the engineering works. Finished goods moved from the factories to the merchants' warehouses, and then to the ports. The physical infrastructure of all this movement required storage at every stage. Manchester's warehouse district, centred on what is now the Northern Quarter and Piccadilly, but extending across a much wider area of the city centre, was at its peak in the mid-19th century, the most concentrated collection of commercial warehouses in the world. The buildings, multi-storey, brick-built, with iron internal frames in the later examples, ornamented with pilasters and cornices in the Italianate or Gothic styles that Victorian commercial architecture favoured, lined streets that were designed for the movement of heavy goods vehicles, and on the upper floors of every building, facing the street below, were the loading doors. The Manchester loading doors of the Victorian period are, in many respects, the exemplar of the form. They are larger than their medieval predecessors, because the goods they handled were larger and heavier. They are more numerous on any given building, because the buildings are larger and have more stories to load. They are more regularly spaced, because the warehouses were purpose-built rather than adapted from residential or mixed-use buildings, and purpose-built warehouses could optimize the spacings of loading access for maximum efficiency. And they are fitted with the full mechanical apparatus of Victorian industrial loading, iron hoist beams projecting from the wall above each door, sheave blocks still visible on many surviving examples, the hooks and rings from which the block and tackle systems were suspended. The height of the Manchester loading doors is, as with their medieval predecessors, determined primarily by the height of the vehicles that were to be loaded beneath them. But the vehicles had changed. Where the medieval merchant had used large-wheeled farm carts, the Victorian warehouse district had purpose-built flatbed drays, lower, wider, with smaller wheels designed for urban cobblestone surfaces, rather than rural tracks. The dray bed was lower than the medieval cart bed, which meant that the loading door could be placed slightly lower for the same working convenience. But the buildings were also taller, 5 or 6 stories, rather than 2 or 3, which meant more loading doors at different heights, each one serving a different floor. The Victorian warehouse also introduced something that the medieval building rarely had: a systematic relationship between the loading doors at different heights and the internal organization of the building. In a well-designed Victorian warehouse, each floor had a specific function in the processing or storage sequence, and the loading door on that floor was positioned to facilitate that specific function. Raw cotton arrived at the lower loading doors, closest to street level, and thus most convenient for the initial unloading. Processed goods left from higher loading doors, where they had been stored awaiting dispatch. The vertical organization of the building was legible from the street in the arrangement of the loading doors, if you knew how to read it. Liverpool's warehouse heritage is somewhat different from Manchester's, reflecting the city's function as a port rather than a manufacturing centre. Where Manchester stored the raw materials and finished goods of the textile trade, Liverpool stored the enormously diverse cargo that passed through what was, for much of the 19th century, the busiest port in the world. Tobacco, sugar, cotton, timber, grain, manufactured goods inward and outward, all of it required warehouse space somewhere between the ship's hold and its final destination. The Liverpool warehouse buildings along the waterfront and in the streets immediately behind it were adapted to the specific requirements of port storage, which differed from inland warehouse requirements in important ways. Port warehouses needed to be extremely secure. Tobacco and spirits in particular were subject to high levels of duty, and the customs authorities required bonded storage that was difficult to break into. This security requirement produced a specific warehouse architecture: deep plan buildings with few windows at street level, strong iron doors and shutters on the loading openings, and the entire external appearance designed to communicate impregnability. The Liverpool tobacco warehouses, the greatest of which was Stanley Dock Tobacco Warehouse, completed in 1901 and still one of the largest brick buildings in the world, took these security requirements to their logical extreme. The loading doors are massive, iron-framed affairs that could be locked against the entire world if necessary. The hoist beams are heavy cast-iron structures. The whole apparatus communicates industrial-scale security for industrial-scale goods. But the fundamental principle, door in the wall, goods raised to the floor, hoist beam above, mechanical lifting system, is unchanged from the medieval wool warehouse. It is simply larger, heavier, and more thoroughly engineered. Between Manchester and Liverpool, the goods moved by canal. The Bridgewater Canal, opened in 1761, was the first major artificial waterway of the Industrial Revolution in England, and it transformed the economics of coal transport so dramatically that it sparked a canal-building frenzy that, over the following 60 years, connected almost every significant industrial centre in England to at least one navigable waterway. The canals in turn generated their own specific variety of elevated doorway. The canal warehouse loading door. Canal warehouses are a distinctive building type. They are typically built right at the canal edge, often with the lower floor partially below canal level, to allow direct loading from boats moored at the side of the building. The loading door faces the canal rather than the street. Or, in many cases, there are loading doors on both sides, one facing the street for road vehicles and one facing the canal for boats. The canal side door is typically lower than the street side door because canal boats sat lower in the water than carts sat on the road. Both doors give access to the same internal space, but they are at different heights because the vehicles they served were at different heights. This dual loading arrangement is visible in many surviving canal-side warehouses, most accessibly in the northwest of England, where the canal system was most developed and where the most complete examples survive. The warehouses of Castlefield in Manchester, which sit at the junction of the Bridgewater Canal and the Rochdale Canal, are particularly good examples. They were built to serve boats coming in from both canal systems, and they were also served by road vehicles from the streets above. The result is a building with multiple loading doors at multiple heights, each one calibrated to a different access technology. The railways, when they arrived in the 1830s and 1840s, added yet another layer to this complexity. Railway goods sheds and railway warehouses had their own loading door heights, calibrated to the height of railway wagons, which was different from the height of canal boats and different from the height of horse-drawn road vehicles. In towns where all three loading technologies coexisted, road, canal, and rail, in the same district, you can find three different standard door heights in buildings of roughly the same period, reflecting the three different vehicle types that served them. All of this explains why, if you walk through the old commercial districts of any major British industrial city, you encounter elevated doorways at heights that seem inconsistent and sometimes puzzling. They are not inconsistent. Each one makes perfect sense in the context of the loading technology it was designed to serve. They simply reflect the fact that the loading technology changed repeatedly over the course of the period in which these buildings were constructed, and each change left its mark on the door heights of the buildings built to use that technology. Understanding the Industrial Revolution warehouses and their loading doors is not just a matter of understanding an interesting historical building type. It is a matter of understanding the physical substrate on which the current British city sits. Manchester city centre is built on and around the remains of its Victorian warehouse district. Liverpool city centre is built around the surviving and former dock warehouse complexes. Leeds and Bradford and Sheffield and Birmingham all carry in their building stock the legacy of the industrial loading arrangements that shaped them. The doors 3 metres off the ground are not an accident or an anomaly. They are the bones of the city, visible above the skin. York deserves its own extended treatment, not merely because it has an exceptional concentration of elevated doorways, but because the city's history illuminates almost every mechanism that creates them. York is, in this sense, a laboratory for the study of doors 3 metres off the ground, a place where all the different causal factors converge, overlap, and can be compared against each other in a way that is not possible anywhere else in England. The city's Roman origins are relevant here, though not in the way most people might expect. The Romans built at Eboracum on a substantial scale, and the scale of their construction, the width of the roads, the size of the buildings, the depth of the foundations left a physical legacy that shaped everything that came after it. Medieval York did not start from a blank slate. It started from a city-sized deposit of Roman masonry, pottery, metalwork, and organic material that formed the substrate on which the medieval city was built. The depth of this Roman deposit is not uniform. In the areas of the city where Roman construction was most intensive, particularly around the fortress and the colonia, the civilian settlement across the river from the fortress, the deposit is deep, sometimes 3 metres or more. In areas that were less intensively settled in the Roman period, the deposit is thinner. The medieval city, built on top of this variable substrate, consequently sat on a surface that was not flat relative to the natural topography. Some areas were already elevated above others, not because of topography, but because of the accumulated depth of earlier settlement. This matters for elevated doorways because it means that the relationship between a building's doorway and the street outside is not simply a function of when the building was built. It is also a function of how much earlier material had accumulated under that particular part of the street, and how that accumulation compared to the accumulation under adjacent parts of the street. A building whose doorway is now elevated above street level may be elevated partly because of changes in street level that occurred after the building was constructed, and partly because the street it faces sits on a thinner deposit than the land on which the building itself stands. York Street deposits from the Viking period, the 9th and 10th centuries, when the city was known as Jorvik and was one of the most important trading centres in northern Europe, are famously rich. The Coppergate area, excavated in the late 1970s and early 1980s in what was one of the most significant urban archaeological investigations in British history, revealed Viking deposits of organic material preserved by waterlogging at depths of several meters below the modern surface. The sheer quantity of material, the buildings, the artifacts, the animal bones, the textile fragments, the woodwork, testified to an intensively settled urban environment that had been accumulating physical remains for centuries before the Norman conquest. The Viking deposits at Coppergate were eventually covered by medieval and later deposits, raising the street level in that area by several more meters. A building that stood in the Coppergate area in the 11th century had its ground floor at a level that would today be several meters below the street surface. If that building somehow survived intact, it did not, but if it had, its ground floor doorway would today appear to be a subterranean entrance, visible only if you excavated the street around it. What did survive in various parts of York were buildings from later periods: the medieval, the Tudor, the Stuart, that were constructed at ground levels, which are now substantially below the modern street. In Shambles, perhaps York's most famous medieval street, the ground floors of some of the oldest buildings have been raised relative to the street in the opposite direction from what you might expect. Some buildings whose ground floors were originally at street level now have their ground floors elevated above it, because the street surface has been lowered by clearance operations or because the buildings themselves have been raised in subsequent rebuilding. The visual result is surreal. Doorways accessed by descending steps, windows looking down at the street below them. But it is simply the product of the same processes of deposit accumulation and street modification that created the elevated doors elsewhere in the city. The riverside warehouses of York tell a clearer story. The buildings along the Ouse, the merchants' houses and warehouses that lined the river in the medieval and early modern periods show the full range of elevated doorway types in close proximity. There are loading doors facing the river, positioned at the height of the river trade boats that moored beneath them. There are flood doors positioned above the historical floodline for this stretch of the Ouse. There are loading doors facing the street behind the riverside buildings, positioned at the height of the road vehicles that brought goods to and from the waterfront. And there are residential entrances on upper floors, dating from periods when the ground floor was used commercially and the household entrance was on the floor above. In several cases, a single building carries 2 or 3 of these elevated door types. The building was originally built for river trade, with a river-facing loading door. It was later modified for road trade as well, with a street-facing loading door added on the opposite side. At some point in its history, a flood event severe enough to reach the first floor prompted the installation of an emergency access point at second floor level. The building's walls thus carry a stratigraphic record of its entire economic and environmental history, if you know how to read it. The Guild of York's medieval merchants, the merchant adventurers, who traded in cloth and other goods across the North Sea, left one of the most remarkable medieval building complexes in England. The Merchant Adventurers' Hall, which stands more or less intact on Fossgate in the old merchant quarter of the city. The hall was built in the mid-14th century and has been in continuous use since then, making it one of the oldest medieval guild halls in England, still serving a function related to its original purpose. The building complex includes a great hall on the upper level, an undercroft on the lower level, and a hospital that occupied the ground floor of the East End. The Merchant Adventurers' Hall is not, in itself, a building with dramatically elevated doors, but it is the physical and institutional symbol of the merchant community that created the need for the warehouses and merchant houses with elevated doors that lined the adjacent streets. The building's position on Fossgate, which runs from the Foss River toward the centre of the city, reflects the geography of the medieval cloth trade in York. Goods came in by river, were stored in the warehouses along the Foss and the Ouse, were traded and processed in the merchant houses on the streets between the rivers, and left again by river or by road for onward distribution. The concentrated survival of medieval and early modern buildings in York's historic core, protected partly by the city's unusual designation as a World Heritage Site and partly by the active conservation policies of the City Council and English Heritage, means that the elevated doorways of York are more accessible to study than those in cities where more wholesale redevelopment has occurred. Many British industrial cities lost their pre-industrial building stock almost entirely in the redevelopment waves of the 20th century. York, by contrast, still contains substantial quantities of its medieval, Tudor and Georgian fabric, including many buildings with original or near-original elevated doorways still in place. This has made York something of a test case for architectural historians studying the elevated doorway phenomenon. Studies conducted by the York Archaeological Trust, the University of York's Archaeology and History departments, and independent researchers have produced a more detailed picture of the distribution and dating of elevated doors in York than exists for almost any other British city. The results of this research are consistent with the general argument made in this documentary. The doors are at different heights for different reasons. The heights encode historical information about the economic and environmental history of the buildings that carry them, and the popular explanation, they are loading doors, is true for some of them, partly true for others, and substantially misleading for a significant minority. The city's flood history is documented in the archives of the York Civic Trust and the Environment Agency, which maintain records of significant flood events going back several centuries. Cross-referencing these flood records with the heights of elevated doorways in the flood-prone areas of the city produces results that are, to anyone interested in the intersection of environmental and architectural history, genuinely exciting. The doors are not arbitrary. They are calibrated to specific historical flood events, and in several cases, it is possible to identify the specific flood that prompted the construction of a specific elevated access point. The flood of 1625, one of the most severe ooze floods in the historical record, appears to have prompted a wave of building modifications in the riverside areas of York, several of which included the installation of elevated access points at heights corresponding to the documented flood level of that event. The flood of 1892, another exceptionally severe event, prompted further modifications, some of which involved raising existing elevated doors or installing new ones at heights that superseded the 1625 installations. The visual record in York's old buildings is, in this respect, a history of flood response told in timber and stone. The question of why this information is not better known, better documented, and better explained to the thousands of visitors who walk through York every year is one that this documentary will return to. For the moment, the point is simply that York is the place where the elevated doorway story is most completely preserved and most fully legible, and that even in York, the full story is not told. Bristol presents a different, but equally illuminating version of the elevated doorway story, shaped by a port history that differs fundamentally from York's river trading past and by a topography that created its own distinctive challenges for builders and merchants. The city sits at the confluence of the rivers Avon and Frome, in a valley cut through the limestone plateau of the Mourne Deeps. The Avon, below Bristol, is a tidal river. It drains into the Bristol Channel, which has one of the largest tidal ranges in the world, the second largest, in fact. The difference between high tide and low tide in the Bristol Channel is routinely over 13 meters, and in the narrow gorge of the Avon below the city, this tidal energy concentrates into a powerful surge that swept the river up through the heart of the medieval city twice a day, every day. This tidal flooding was different in character from the seasonal river flooding of York. It was predictable, tied to the lunar cycle, rather than to rainfall, and it was daily. Merchants and builders in medieval Bristol knew exactly when the water would rise and exactly how high it would go. They could plan around it in ways that were simply not possible in a city subject to unpredictable, catastrophic flooding. The elevated doors of Bristol's old city reflect this predictability. They are positioned precisely at the level of the high tide mark for a specific quayside location, not at the level of a catastrophic flood event that might occur once in a generation. The medieval quayside of Bristol, the area around the Backs and the quay, where the Frome met the tidal Avon, was the commercial heart of one of the most important ports in medieval England. Bristol was the principal gateway to Ireland and to the Atlantic, and its merchant community was in some respects more adventurous and more internationally connected than that of any other English provincial city. John Cabot sailed from Bristol in 1497 to reach Newfoundland. The Bristol merchants who financed the slave trade in the 17th and 18th centuries were building on a maritime commercial tradition that stretched back to the 12th century. The buildings that lined the medieval quayside were built to cope with the tidal flooding as a simple fact of operational life. Every merchant house on the waterfront had its ground floor, designed to be regularly inundated. The valuable goods were not kept on the ground floor. The counting rooms, the sample rooms, the offices where business was transacted, all of these were on the first or second floor, accessed by external stairs or by internal stairs from a ground floor that was expected to get wet. The elevated doors that served these upper floors were not emergency facilities. They were the normal, everyday entrances to the working space of a Bristol merchant house. This is a crucial distinction that separates Bristol's elevated door tradition from York's. In York, the elevated flood doors were emergency facilities, alternative access routes for when the primary street-level entrance was unavailable. In Bristol's tidal waterfront buildings, the elevated entrance was the primary entrance. The ground floor was utility space, used for storage of goods that could tolerate getting wet. Barrels of wine, casks of salted fish, bales of goods wrapped in oilskin, and cleaned and restocked after each tidal event. The upper floor was where business happened, and it was reached by an external staircase from the quayside that rose above the high tide mark. The external staircases themselves are mostly gone. They were removed over the centuries as the tidal flooding of the old city centre became less frequent, partly through changes in the river regime as the city grew and the Avon was progressively managed, and partly through the extraordinary project of the floating harbour, completed in 1809, which impounded a section of the Avon to create a non-tidal harbour and fundamentally changed the tidal dynamics of the city centre. The floating harbour project, engineered by William Jessup and completed by Isambard Kingdom Brunel's father, Mark Brunel, was one of the most ambitious urban engineering projects of its era. By cutting a new channel, the New Cut, to take the tidal flow of the Avon around the south side of the city, and by installing lock gates to hold the water in the old channel at a constant level, it created a harbour that ships could enter and leave at any state of the tide. This transformed Bristol's competitiveness as a port at a time when the growing size of ships was making tidal harbours increasingly inconvenient. But the floating harbour had an unintended architectural consequence. By eliminating the tidal flooding from the old city waterfront, it made the external staircases that served the upper floor entrances of the riverside buildings redundant. The staircases were removed. The upper floor entrances remained, but they now opened onto nothing. Sheer drops to a quayside that was no longer periodically flooded. Some were converted into windows. Some were converted into loading doors, now serving a new commercial function. Some were simply left as doors, opening onto nothing, 3 or 4 meters above the quayside, for the next 2 centuries. Walk along the harbour side in Bristol today, in the areas that have survived urban redevelopment, particularly the Redcliffe and the Welsh Back districts, where a significant quantity of pre-industrial building stock remains, and you will see the legacy of this transformation. Buildings where the original tidal entrance arrangement is still readable in the facade, even though the original function has been gone for over 2 centuries. Buildings where the conversion from tidal entrance to loading door was made and is now clearly visible in the different stonework around the altered opening. Buildings where the opening survives in its original form, a testament to a commercial and environmental history that most visitors walk past without any awareness that they are seeing the fossilized remains of a daily operational routine that shaped the city for 600 years. The Bristol case also illustrates an aspect of elevated doorways that is often overlooked: their relationship to the specific goods being traded. The tidal waterfront buildings of medieval Bristol were not primarily wool warehouses. They were wine merchants' premises, fish merchants' premises, general import and export warehouses, dealing in the highly diverse cargo that moved through a major Atlantic port. The specific goods affected the specific height and arrangement of the elevated doors, because different goods required different handling and different storage conditions. Wine, for example, arrived in wooden barrels. Barrels are heavy, round, and awkward to handle. You cannot carry them up a ladder. You cannot easily hoist them with a simple rope and pulley. You need a substantial platform at the loading height, a strong mechanical system for raising the barrel from the cart or boat below, and a wide, tall door opening that will admit a barrel on its side. The wine merchants' loading doors in Bristol's Old City are recognisably different from the wool merchants' loading doors of York or Norwich. Wider, taller, built with more robust ironwork, positioned with a broader platform area at the top of the external steps. These differences reflect the different operational requirements of the two trades. Fish arrived in a different form and required different facilities. Salted fish came in barrels like wine, but fresh fish was handled differently, in open containers that needed to be moved quickly to a cool storage space before it spoiled. The fish merchants' premises on the Bristol waterfront had their own specific access arrangements, optimized for the rapid handling of perishable goods in a way that wine or wool merchants had no need to consider. The diversity of goods flowing through Bristol created, over centuries, a diversity of elevated door types that is not found in the same degree in more specialized trading towns. A wool town like Lavenham had essentially one type of elevated door, the wool warehouse loading door, built to a fairly consistent specification because the goods and the handling requirements were consistent. A general trading port like Bristol had multiple types, each adapted to the specific requirements of a specific trade, and the surviving building stock reflects this diversity in ways that can be read by anyone with enough knowledge of the historical trades to recognize what they are looking at. The story of Bristol's elevated doors is also inevitably entangled with the story of the transatlantic slave trade that made Bristol one of the wealthiest cities in England in the 18th century. The warehouses and merchant houses of the slave trade era were built on the same waterfronts and in the same commercial districts as the medieval trading buildings, and they continued and extended the elevated door tradition for the same practical reasons. The goods that moved through the Bristol slave trade economy, tobacco, sugar, cotton on the inward voyage, manufactured goods outward, all required warehouse storage with elevated loading access. The buildings that survive from this period carry their loading doors with the same architectural logic as their medieval predecessors and the same absence of moral commentary. This is not the place for an extended discussion of the slave trade's role in Bristol's architectural history, which has been addressed in detail elsewhere and with the attention it deserves. The point here is simply that the elevated loading doors of the slave trade era warehouses are part of the same architectural tradition as the elevated tidal entrance doors of the medieval waterfront buildings. The form persisted because the functional requirement persisted, even as the specific goods and the specific trade changed. Norwich occupies a unique position in the story of British elevated doorways, and that position is not one that most people who visit the city, or most people who write about it, have fully appreciated. The city was, for a sustained period in the later medieval and early modern periods, the second largest city in England after London. Its wealth came primarily from the textile trade, specifically from the fine worsted cloths known as Norwich stuffs, and from the arrival in the 16th century of Flemish and Walloon refugee weavers who brought with them techniques and designs that transformed the city's textile production. The Flemish and Walloon immigrants, known collectively as the Strangers, from the period term for foreign residents, settled in the area around Strangers' Hall and the lanes running down to the river, and they brought with them not only their weaving skills but their architectural practices. The building types they had used in the Netherlands and in the Flemish cities, the narrow-fronted, deep-plan townhouse with a gable end facing the street and loading access on the upper floors, were adapted to the Norwich context and became extremely influential on the city's commercial architecture. The gabled house with an elevated loading door or loading hatch on the gable end is, in Norwich, almost always associated with the textile trade. The narrow frontage reflects the width of the medieval plot. The depth reflects the need to accommodate both working space and storage space, and the elevated loading access on the gable reflects the Dutch and Flemish practice of using the roof space and upper floors for the dry storage of yarn, cloth, and finished goods. The architectural type was not native to Norwich. It was imported, quite literally, by the stranger community. But once established, it spread throughout the city's merchant and artisan quarters. The survival rate of these stranger-influenced buildings in Norwich is remarkable by any standard. While many British cities lost their pre-industrial building stock in the clearances and redevelopments of the 20th century, Norwich retained a much higher proportion of its medieval and early modern fabric, partly because the city's economic decline in the 19th century meant there was less pressure and less money for wholesale redevelopment, and partly because the conservation movement caught up with Norwich early enough to protect many of the most important buildings. The result is that Elm Hill, Norwich's most celebrated medieval street, retains a sequence of buildings that is, by British urban standards, extraordinary in its completeness. The buildings lining Elm Hill range in date from the 15th to the 17th century, and while all have been modified to some degree, the essential fabric is original. Many of them retain elevated doorways or hatches on their upper floors, either still functioning or now sealed, and several retain the ghost of loading arrangements, hoist beam housings, worn stone surrounds on loading door sills, iron rings and hooks, that allow the original arrangement to be reconstructed. But Elm Hill is only the most visible part of the story. The lanes running off Elm Hill and the streets in the wider area between the cathedral and the river, Tombland, Wensum Street, Magdalen Street, contain dozens of buildings that the casual visitor walks past without recognizing their significance. These are merchant houses and artisan workshops that retain, in various states of completeness, the elevated loading access arrangements that served the textile trade for 2 or 3 centuries. The most instructive examples are in the lanes running down to the river at Fye Bridge. These lanes, Wensum Street and its various tributaries, were the heart of the medieval stranger quarter, and the buildings that survive there include some of the best examples of the imported Flemish building type in England. The narrow-fronted, gabled houses with upper-floor loading access are visible in several properties, and the relationship between the building type and the river trade is clear. Goods arrived by riverboat were raised through the loading hatch or loading door to the upper floors, were processed or stored there, and were distributed by road or river as required. The height of the Norwich elevated doors reflects the city's specific combination of commercial geography and flood history. The River Wensum, which runs through the old city, is not a tidal river. It is a chalk stream draining a catchment that is relatively small by the standards of rivers like the Ouse or the Avon. But it floods periodically, and the flooding of the Wensum was a significant factor in the commercial and residential history of the riverfront areas. The elevated doors of the Wensum frontage buildings reflect both the loading requirements of the river trade and the flood management requirements of a riverside location. There is a further dimension to the Norwich story that is rarely mentioned in the standard accounts of the city's architectural heritage: the role of the cattle market. Norwich was the site of one of the largest periodic cattle markets in England, held on the open ground of what is now the marketplace and the surrounding streets. The twice-yearly cattle fairs and the weekly cattle market that operated throughout the year brought huge quantities of livestock through the city's streets on their way to and from the market ground, and the goods associated with the cattle trade: hides, tallow, bone, leather goods, dried meat were among the most important commodities stored in the city's commercial warehouses. Cattle-related goods have specific storage requirements that differ from textile goods. Hides need to be stored flat, in large quantities, in a well-ventilated space. Tallow, rendered animal fat used for candles, soap, and lubrication, needs to be stored in sealed containers away from heat. Leather goods need to be stored in conditions that prevent drying and cracking. The warehouses that served the cattle trade were therefore physically different from the textile warehouses, with different floor plans, different ventilation arrangements, and different loading access configurations. The loading doors of the hide and tallow warehouses in Norwich are typically wider and slightly lower than those of the textile warehouses. This is because hides were stored in rolls or stacks on the warehouse floor and needed to be moved horizontally rather than vertically. A wide lower door allowed a roll of hides to be carried through on a man's shoulder rather than hoisted vertically on a rope. The difference is small but consistent, and it reflects the different ergonomics of handling different goods. This level of specificity, the adaptation of loading door dimensions to the specific handling requirements of specific goods, is one of the reasons why a simple categorization of elevated doors as loading doors is inadequate. The doors were designed for specific goods, handled in specific ways, by workers with specific physical capabilities and using specific tools. The physical archaeology of the door, its width, its height above the floor of the room it serves, the depth of the reveals on either side of it, the evidence of wear on the sill and the frame. All of this encodes information about the specific operational use of the building that goes far beyond the simple fact of loading. Norwich is also notable for the unusually complete documentation of its building stock. The Royal Commission on the Historical Monuments of England conducted a detailed survey of Norwich's historic buildings in the 1970s and 1980s, producing a multi-volume record that includes descriptions and measurements of many of the elevated doorways in the older parts of the city. This documentation, combined with the physical survival of the buildings themselves, makes Norwich one of the best documented British cities for the study of elevated access arrangements in pre-industrial commercial buildings. The documentation, however, has not been synthesized or interpreted in a way that makes it accessible to the general public. The RCHME volumes are dense academic documents written for specialists, and the information they contain about elevated doorways is scattered through descriptions of individual buildings rather than assembled into any kind of thematic analysis. A visitor to Norwich who wanted to understand the elevated doors they were seeing would have to work through many hundreds of pages of technical description to extract the relevant information. Which is to say, the information is not practically accessible at all. This is not a problem unique to Norwich. It is the general state of knowledge about elevated doorways in British cities, extensively documented at the level of individual buildings, in records created for other purposes and not synthesized into any accessible form, and consequently invisible to the public that walks past the doors every day. Of all the explanations for elevated doorways in British cities, the one that is most consistently overlooked and least well understood by the general public is the simplest. The street got higher. This seems counterintuitive. Streets, we tend to assume, are more or less permanent features of the landscape. They were laid down at a certain level, and that level has not changed. The buildings on either side of the street were built when the street was at that level, and so their doors open onto the street at the right height. If the door is elevated, it is because there is a specific functional reason for it. This assumption is incorrect. British streets have risen substantially over the centuries, and the rise has not been uniform. Some streets in some cities have risen by half a metre. Some have risen by a metre or more. A very few have risen by 2 metres or even 3 metres, in cases where a combination of especially deep historic deposits, especially intensive early settlement, and especially limited subsequent clearing, has created an exceptionally thick layer of accumulated urban material above the original ground surface. The mechanisms of street-level rise are multiple and cumulative. First, there is the accumulation of occupation debris. Every generation of urban residents produces waste. Broken pottery, discarded bones, ash from fires, worn-out clothing and tools, decayed organic material, and not all of this waste was removed. In the pre-modern period, much of it was not removed at all. It was simply left in situ, or spread on the street surface and trodden down. This constant accumulation of organic and inorganic waste raised the street surface slowly but continuously, millimetre by millimetre, year by year. Second, there is the accumulation of building demolition debris. When a building in a pre-modern city was demolished or burned down, the rubble was not necessarily cleared from the site. It was more often levelled and built over. The foundations of successive buildings thus sat at progressively higher levels, and the streets between them, receiving the overspill of demolition debris from adjacent sites, also rose. In cities with long histories of continuous settlement, the Roman, Saxon, Viking, medieval, post-medieval, and modern deposits succeeding each other in the same streets. This process has created underground stratigraphies of extraordinary depth and complexity. Third, there is the accumulation of flood deposits. Rivers that flood leave behind sediment when the water recedes, and this sediment, laid down in thin layers with each flood event, gradually raises the level of the floodplain. A street in a flood-prone area that received significant sediment deposits with each flood event might have risen by several centimetres per century, adding up to a substantial change in level over the lifetime of a city. Fourth, there is deliberate road resurfacing and repair. Streets were periodically remetalled, covered with a new layer of gravel, flint, cobbles, or later asphalt or tarmac when the existing surface wore out. Each resurfacing added a new layer to the street, raising it slightly. Over centuries of regular maintenance, the cumulative addition could be significant. The combined effect of all four mechanisms is most dramatic in the oldest parts of the oldest cities. In Roman Londinium, the street surfaces of the 2nd century AD lie at depths of 4 to 6 meters below the modern street surface in many parts of the City of London. Walking on the modern streets of the city, you are walking several meters above the level at which Roman Londoners walked. The medieval streets of London lie at 2 to 3 meters below the modern surface. The Tudor and Stuart streets are typically 1 to 2 meters below. Each era's street surface is clearly visible in any deep excavation, forming a layer cake of urban history whose depth testifies to the continuous accumulation of material over 2,000 years of occupation. London is an extreme case because it has been continuously and intensively occupied for longer than almost any other British city and has had less wholesale clearance of its historic deposits than, say, Bristol or Liverpool, which were both significantly redeveloped in the post-war period. But the process is visible in every old British city to a greater or lesser degree. In Winchester, the old Saxon capital of England, excavations have revealed that the street surfaces of the Saxon burh, the planned street grid laid out in the 9th century, lie at depths of 1 to 3 meters below the modern surface. The medieval city of Winchester was built at a higher level than the Saxon city, which was itself at a higher level than the Roman city. The modern city, in turn, is at a higher level than the medieval city. Someone who walked through Winchester in 1100 AD walked in a valley compared to someone who walks through it today. In Chester, one of the most complete Roman-walled cities in Britain, the Roman street deposits are several meters below the modern surface, and the famous rows, the continuous raised walkways at first-floor level that run through the medieval city centre, are widely interpreted by architectural historians as an adaptation to the problem of a street level that was progressively rising above the level of the Roman and early medieval buildings. Rather than raise the front walls of existing buildings to accommodate a rising street, Chester's medieval builders created an elevated walkway at first-floor level that allowed access to the upper floors of buildings whose ground floors were gradually being buried. The rows are, in this interpretation, the most elaborate and self-conscious architectural response to the problem of rising street levels in any British city. This interpretation of the Chester rows is contested. Other architectural historians argue that the rows are primarily a response to the specific commercial needs of Chester's medieval market, providing covered shopping space protected from the weather. The two explanations are not mutually exclusive, and the most convincing accounts of the rows acknowledge both the commercial and the topographic factors. But the topographic factor, the fact that Chester's street levels have risen substantially since the Roman period, burying lower floors of successive buildings, is real and documented, and it is at least part of the explanation for why the characteristic first-floor level of the rows corresponds roughly to what would have been ground floor level in the Roman and early medieval city. Chester's rows are the most visible and architecturally elaborate example of adaptation to rising street levels in Britain, but the same process has produced elevated doorways in less spectacular and less architecturally self-conscious ways in cities all across the country. In many cases, the elevated door is simply the original ground floor entrance of a building that was constructed when the street was at a lower level, and whose entrance has been left in place as the street gradually rose around it, eventually reaching a level at which the entrance appeared elevated. This process is particularly visible in areas of cities where street resurfacing has been more intensive than average. Typically, in commercial centres, where the surface was subjected to greater wear and required more frequent maintenance, and where adjacent building stock was not comprehensively redeveloped in the 19th or 20th century. A building that survived intact from the 17th century, on a street that was resurfaces many times in the 18th and 19th centuries, might find its original ground floor entrance at first floor level by the 20th century, simply because the street rose while the building stayed still. The buildings most likely to show this effect are those with stone or brick ground floors, because these materials are more resistant to the gradual burial that affects timber-framed buildings, which tended to rot at the base and be replaced. A stone-built building from the 16th century might retain its original entrance arrangement intact, while the street outside rose half a metre or more over the following 2 centuries. The entrance, originally at street level, would appear by the 19th century to be elevated, accessed by a short flight of steps up from the street, and by the 20th century to be significantly elevated, requiring a substantial staircase or a noticeable step up into the building. The implications of this process for the interpretation of elevated doorways are significant. When we see a door at 3 meters above the modern street, we cannot immediately know whether it was originally placed at that height for a specific functional reason, or whether it was originally at street level and has been left in place as the street rose beneath it. Distinguishing between the two cases requires investigation, examination of the building's fabric to establish its construction date and original floor levels, comparison with the documented historical street levels in the area, and, where available, examination of historical maps and illustrations that may show the building's relationship to the street in earlier periods. This kind of investigation has been conducted systematically in only a very few British cities, and even there, only in specific areas. The general public encounters the results of this work only in the form of occasional heritage plaques and museum displays that do not explain the process in any detail. The full complexity of the relationship between rising street levels and elevated doorways remains, for most people, entirely invisible. It is one of the most counterintuitive aspects of the elevated doorway phenomenon, because it implies that some elevated doors were never meant to be elevated at all. They were meant to be at ground level. The ground moved, the door stayed. And what we see today, 3 meters above the street, is the original street-level entrance of a building that has been slowly, invisibly, inexorably raised above its historical context by 2,000 years of urban accumulation. Chester demands its own extended treatment in any serious discussion of elevated access in British cities, because the Chester Rows are the most sustained and architecturally sophisticated example of what can happen when a city confronts the problem of its street levels, rising above its buildings over a period of centuries. The rows are a system of elevated walkways running at first-floor level along the main streets of Chester's medieval city centre: Eastgate Street, Watergate Street, Northgate Street, and Bridge Street. They are not merely elevated pavements. They are covered walkways fronted by shops, with the shops at row level on the first floor and further shops at street level below them, creating a two-level commercial frontage that is unique in the world. Nothing quite like it exists anywhere else in Britain, and few urban features in British history have generated more scholarly debate about their origins and purpose. The standard explanation offered to visitors, reproduced in tourist guides and on interpretation boards, is that the rows developed in the medieval period as a convenient covered shopping environment, protecting shoppers from the rain that is a frequent feature of Chester's climate. This explanation has the virtue of plausibility and the additional virtue of simplicity, but it does not account for the most puzzling feature of the rows. The relationship between the row level and the ground floor level is not consistent. In some sections of the rows, the row level is approximately at the level you would expect for a standard first floor, roughly 3 meters above the street. In other sections, it is considerably lower, almost at the level of the street in some places, almost at a standard second floor in others. If the rows were simply a designed covered walkway, you would expect the level to be consistent. It is not. The inconsistency is the key to the deeper explanation. The rows are not a single feature built to a single design. They are an accretion of adaptations made over several centuries to the problem of a street level that was rising faster than the buildings on either side of it could adapt. The Roman deposits in Chester are exceptionally deep. Roman Chester, Diva Victrix, was a major legionary fortress and one of the most important Roman settlements in Britain, and the 2 centuries of intensive Roman occupation left a substantial archaeological deposit. On top of the Roman deposits sit Saxon, Norman, medieval, and later deposits, each adding to the overall depth and to the progressive raising of the street surface. At some point in the medieval period, the exact date is disputed, with estimates ranging from the 12th to the 14th century, the street level in Chester's commercial centre had risen sufficiently above the floor levels of the existing buildings that a new approach was needed. The existing buildings had their ground floors at a level that was now below the street. Their ground floor entrances were accessed by stepping down from the street into the building, which was awkward and potentially hazardous, particularly in wet weather when the steps became slippery and water ran into the sunken doorways. The solution that Chester developed, apparently through a combination of municipal regulation and individual adaptation, rather than through any single planned design, was to establish a continuous walkway at the level of the existing first floors of the buildings, supported on pillars rising from the street below, and to treat this walkway as the new primary commercial level. Shops opened onto the row at first floor level rather than onto the street at ground level. The space beneath the row, between the pillars, became its secondary commercial space. Storage, lower grade shops, access passages. This solution was remarkably effective. It preserved the commercial value of the existing building stock, which would have been enormously expensive to raise or rebuild to accommodate the new street level. It provided covered shopping space, which was genuinely valuable in Chester's wet climate, and it created a distinctive urban environment that became a defining feature of the city's commercial identity, maintained and extended over the subsequent centuries as a conscious urban amenity rather than merely a functional adaptation. The architectural evidence for the original relationship between the buildings and the street is visible throughout the rows in ways that most visitors do not notice. At the junction of the row level with the building facades, you can frequently see changes in masonry that indicate the original ground floor level of the buildings. Windows that were originally at the right height for a ground floor room are now at knee height from the row level above them. Doorways that were originally at street level are now accessed by descending a step or two from the row walkway. The stratigraphy of the urban accumulation is legible in the building facades if you know what to look for. The most instructive sections of the rows for understanding this process are those where the relationship between the buildings and the walkway has been disturbed by later rebuilding. When a building on the row was demolished and rebuilt in the 18th or 19th century, the rebuilding often rationalized the relationship between the building and the row level, eliminating the signs of the original adaptation. But buildings that survive with minimal later alteration, and Chester has a number of these, particularly in the Watergate Street area, still show clearly the original adaptation process. The row level threading through and around buildings that were originally built at a lower level and adapted in situ rather than rebuilt. Chester's rows also illustrate a point that is relevant to the broader story of elevated doorways in British cities, the relationship between elevated access and commercial competition. In a city where the elevated walkway is the primary commercial level, properties with a row front are substantially more valuable than properties without one. The desirability of row frontage created economic pressure to extend the row system, to maintain it to a good standard, and to adapt new buildings to the row level rather than to the street level. This pressure sustained the distinctive character of Chester's commercial centre over the centuries after the original adaptation was made, and it explains why the rows survived in Chester when they disappeared in other medieval cities that may have had similar features. The question of whether other British cities once had systems similar to Chester's rows is one that has been discussed by urban historians for several decades. The evidence suggests that several did, at least in partial or local form. There are records from medieval London of elevated walkways in some commercial streets, though none survive. There is physical evidence in some Norwich buildings of a row-level shop frontage that may once have extended further than the surviving fragments suggest. There are hints in the building archaeology of several other medieval cities that elevated commercial frontages were more widespread in the medieval period than the surviving evidence would suggest. If this is correct, if elevated commercial frontages were a more general feature of medieval British city centres than their current near absence suggests, then Chester's rows are not an anomaly. They are a survival. They are what remained when the general adaptation strategy that other cities also pursued was maintained in Chester and lost elsewhere. The elevated doors of other cities, the loading doors, the flood doors, the original ground floor entrances left in place as streets rose, are the fragments of a much more extensive pattern of elevated access that has been almost entirely lost, except where, as in Chester, the specific economic and cultural dynamics of a particular city created conditions for its preservation. This perspective transforms the elevated doorway from a curiosity into a window. It is not just a door in the wrong place. It is a fragment of a general adaptive response to the complex, messy, multi-layered reality of building and living in a city that has been continuously occupied for centuries and whose physical form has changed, accumulated, subsided, risen, and shifted in ways that the individual building could not always keep pace with. There is a question that underlies everything discussed in this documentary, and it has not yet been directly addressed. Why don't people know this? Why do thousands of visitors walk through York and Bristol and Norwich and Chester every day, past buildings that carry in their walls a comprehensive record of the economic and environmental history of their city, and emerge from their visit knowing almost nothing about what they have seen? The short answer is that the institutions responsible for explaining the built environment to the public have consistently failed to do so with any depth or coherence. But the short answer is not the interesting answer. The interesting answer involves understanding why this failure has occurred, who is responsible for it, and what it would take to address it. The heritage interpretation industry in Britain, the network of museums, heritage centres, conservation bodies, local history societies, and tourism operations that collectively manage the presentation of the historic environment to the public, is substantial. It employs thousands of people, occupies hundreds of buildings, and spends hundreds of millions of pounds annually. It produces enormous quantities of interpretive material: plaques, guidebooks, leaflets, museum displays, heritage trails, audio guides, digital content. It has, in short, ample resources and ample opportunity to explain the elevated doorway phenomenon in the depth it deserves. It does not do so, and the reason it does not do so is not, primarily, a matter of resources or opportunity. It is a matter of institutional culture and incentive. Heritage interpretation in Britain is organised around landmarks and singular achievements. It celebrates the exceptional rather than the typical. It explains the beautiful church, the famous castle, the well-preserved manor house. It is not organised around the explanation of urban building types and their relationship to the economic and environmental history of the city. When it attempts to explain urban history at all, it tends to do so in terms of events. The Civil War, the Industrial Revolution, the Victorian slum clearances, rather than in terms of the physical evidence that those events left behind. This event-centered approach to heritage interpretation produces a specific kind of knowledge gap. Visitors come away from a heritage experience knowing about specific historical events and specific historical figures, but they know very little about the physical environment in which those events occurred and through which those figures moved. They know that the Industrial Revolution transformed British cities, but they cannot read that transformation in the buildings they see around them. They know that floods were a historical problem in York, but they cannot connect that knowledge to the specific elevated doors on King's Staithe that testify to the response. The elevated doorway is precisely the kind of physical evidence that event-centered heritage interpretation handles poorly. It is not a monument to a specific event. It is not associated with a famous person or a significant date. It is the residue of a continuous, normal, practical process: commercial loading, flood management, street-level change, that occurred unremarkably over centuries, leaving its mark in the built environment without ever attracting the kind of documentary record that heritage interpretation can attach a story to. The local history societies and amateur architectural historians who have paid the most attention to elevated doorways are typically enthusiastic and often knowledgeable, but they operate at the margins of the heritage industry rather than at its center. Their publications, local history journals, parish history booklets, building recording reports, reach audiences of dozens or hundreds, rather than the hundreds of thousands who visit the sites every year. The information is gathered and published, but it does not reach the people who need it. Professional architectural historians know the material extremely well, but they write primarily for academic audiences. The technical vocabulary of architectural history, string course, quoin, reveal, chamfer, jetty, overhang, is not widely understood by the general public, and academic architectural history publications do not attempt to explain it. The result is a body of expert knowledge that is effectively inaccessible to anyone outside the discipline. English Heritage, now Historic England, has conducted extensive surveys of historic building stock throughout the country, and these surveys contain detailed information about elevated doorways in specific buildings and specific areas. The surveys are available in principle to anyone who requests them, and they are increasingly available online through the Historic Environment Record databases maintained by local planning authorities. In practice, however, these databases are difficult to navigate for non-specialists, and the information they contain is buried in technical site records rather than presented in any interpretive form. The planning system, which requires applicants for planning permission to assess the impact of proposed developments on historic buildings and settings, generates a large quantity of building recording work by qualified historic building surveyors. Some of this work covers elevated doorways in considerable detail, but building recording reports commissioned in connection with planning applications are technical documents produced for a specific statutory purpose, and they are not written with a public audience in mind. They sit in planning files, available in principle to anyone who requests them, but in practice, read only by the planning officers who assessed the application and the building surveyors who wrote them. The combination of all these factors produces the situation we observe. Extensive knowledge about elevated doorways in British cities, distributed across a wide range of specialist publications, professional records, and amateur studies, but not assembled, not synthesized, and not communicated to the general public in any form that could be described as comprehensive or accessible. There is a further factor that is worth acknowledging, because it operates at a more fundamental level than institutional culture or publishing conventions. The elevated doorway, as a subject, does not fit easily into the dominant narrative frameworks of British history, which tend to be organized around politics, religion, war, and the lives of prominent individuals. A door in the wrong place is not a story about a king or a battle or a religious controversy. It is a story about trade, topography, technology, and time, about the physical record of ordinary commercial life over centuries. This is a genuinely interesting story, but it is not the kind of story that British heritage institutions have historically been organized to tell. The growing interest in social history, material culture, and the archaeology of ordinary life, which has been a significant trend in academic history and archaeology over the last 40 years, has begun to shift this situation, but slowly. The elevated doorway remains, for most people, an unexplained feature of the historic urban landscape, noticed by some, puzzling to many, and explained to almost none. Manchester and Liverpool present the elevated doorway phenomenon in its most industrial form. Stripped of the medieval complexity that enriches the story in York or Norwich and presented instead in the stark, functional idiom of Victorian commercial architecture. Manchester's warehouse district at its mid-Victorian peak was, as noted earlier, the largest concentration of commercial storage facilities in the world. The city was the nerve centre of the global cotton trade. Not a port and not a manufacturing centre in the most direct sense, but the commercial hub through which the entire supply chain was organized. Cotton arrived from the American South, from Egypt, from India, and from other producing regions. It was graded, bought, and sold in Manchester. It was sent from Manchester to the spinning mills of Lancashire and the weaving mills of Yorkshire. The finished cloth came back to Manchester, was sold again, and went out to the world from the ports of Liverpool and Salford. All of this commercial activity required paperwork, communication, negotiation, and above all, storage. Merchants who had bought a cargo of cotton needed somewhere to put it while they arranged its onward journey to the mills. Merchants who had contracted to sell a consignment of cloth needed somewhere to hold it while they arranged its shipment from Liverpool. The warehouses of Manchester were the physical infrastructure of these holding operations, and they were built on a scale commensurate with the scale of the trade. The typical Manchester warehouse of the 1820s to 1860s was a 5 or 6-story brick building with a relatively narrow frontage, reflecting the width of the medieval street it stood on, and a considerable depth. The internal floors were supported on cast-iron columns, allowing wide, unobstructed floor areas that could be stacked with bales of cotton or rolls of cloth to the ceiling. The facade, facing the street, was decorated in the Italianate style that Manchester warehouse builders favoured: arched windows, rusticated ground floors, corbelled cornices, giving the commercial buildings a grandeur that expressed the wealth and ambition of the merchants who commissioned them. On each floor, facing the street, was a loading door. The doors were positioned at the same height on each floor, directly above each other, creating a vertical stack of loading openings that ran from the first floor to the 5th or 6th floor of the building. Above each door, projecting from the wall, was the iron hoist beam, the carrying structure from which the block and tackle system was suspended. In some buildings, the hoist beams were retractable, folding up against the wall when not in use, and swinging out over the street when needed for loading. In others, they were fixed projections of the building structure. The drays that served these warehouses, the flatbed horse-drawn vehicles that moved goods through Manchester's narrow commercial streets, were standardized vehicles built to a consistent specification that allowed them to maneuver through the width-constrained streets of the city centre. The bed of the Manchester dray sat at a consistent height above the road surface, and the loading doors of the warehouses were positioned at a consistent height above the pavement that reflected the relationship between the dray bed and the warehouse floor. The standardization of both the vehicles and the loading door heights created a highly efficient loading system. A dray arriving at a warehouse could back up to the wall beneath the appropriate loading door, the hoist operator above could lower the lifting hook directly onto the dray bed, and the goods could be raised smoothly to the correct floor with minimal manual handling. The precision of the system required precision in the height of the loading door, and this precision is visible in the remarkable consistency of loading door heights across the Victorian warehouse district. Liverpool's approach to warehouse design reflected the city's role as a port rather than a commercial entrepot. Port warehouses had different requirements from inland commercial warehouses. They needed to be extremely secure because of customs duties. They needed to be fire-resistant because tobacco and cotton were flammable, and they needed to be accessible from the quayside as well as from the street. These requirements produced a different building type, the bonded warehouse. A bonded warehouse was a facility in which imported goods subject to customs duty could be stored without the duty being paid immediately, as long as the goods remained in the warehouse under customs control. This arrangement was advantageous for merchants who wanted to store goods before deciding whether to import them for domestic sale or to re-export them, because they only paid the duty if and when the goods were actually imported for domestic use. The bonded warehouses of Liverpool were consequently under joint control of the merchant and the customs service, with customs officers having access to ensure the integrity of the stored goods. This security requirement fundamentally shaped the design of Liverpool's bonded warehouses, and in particular, the design of their loading doors. Where a Manchester commercial warehouse might have relatively simple wooden loading doors, adequate security for cotton bales, which were large and difficult to steal without obvious evidence, Liverpool's bonded warehouses had elaborate iron shutters and locks on their loading openings. The tobacco warehouses in particular had loading doors that were designed to prevent the removal of even small quantities of tobacco, because tobacco was one of the most heavily smuggled commodities in England, and the customs service was correspondingly vigilant. The loading doors of Liverpool's Victorian bonded warehouses are consequently heavier, more solidly constructed, and more elaborately secured than their Manchester equivalents. They are also, in many surviving examples, in better condition, because the iron construction that was demanded by security requirements has proved more durable than the timber construction typical of Manchester loading doors. The iron shutters, with their multiple bolts and locks, are sometimes still in place on buildings that have been converted to other uses, silent testimony to the scale of the security operation that once governed their operation. The Albert Dock complex, designed by Jesse Hartley and opened in 1846, is the best preserved example of Liverpool's Victorian dock warehouse architecture. The dock is surrounded on all four sides by five-story warehouses built of brick and cast iron, with no timber in their construction. Hartley specified fireproof construction throughout, having seen too many dock fires to trust timber in a building surrounded by combustible goods. The loading openings in the Albert Dock warehouses face the dock itself rather than a public street, because the loading was done directly from the ship through the dockside. The height of the loading openings reflects the height of the ship's deck above the dock level, which varied depending on the vessel, but was calibrated to the typical ships that used the dock. The Albert Dock was closed as a working dock in 1972 and has been comprehensively converted to cultural and commercial uses. It now houses a branch of Tate Liverpool, the Merseyside Maritime Museum, and numerous restaurants and shops. The conversion has preserved the external fabric of the warehouses, including the loading openings, but it has removed the context that gave them meaning. The loading openings are now windows and decorative features rather than working loading points. The dockside cranes that once operate through them are gone. The ships that loaded and unloaded at the quayside are gone. What remains is the shell of an industrial system that once operated at the cutting edge of global trade. This transformation of working industrial buildings into heritage and leisure venues, a process that has occurred in most of Britain's major industrial city centres over the last 40 years, has been enormously beneficial in preserving built fabric that would otherwise have been demolished. But it has had the unintended consequence of separating the physical fabric from its operational context in ways that make the fabric harder to interpret. A loading door that is now a decorative window element tells you nothing about loading unless you already know what it was and how it worked. The conversion from industrial to heritage use often involves exactly the kind of explanation that is needed, but the explanation is rarely provided at the depth or with the specificity that the building deserves. The Great Fire of London in September 1666, which burned for 3 days and destroyed roughly 370 acres of the medieval city, has a more complicated relationship with elevated doorways than might initially be apparent. The fire's most direct impact on the built environment, the destruction of the medieval street pattern, the rebuilding in brick rather than timber, the widening and straightening of streets, would seem to have disrupted the accumulation of medieval features, including elevated doorways that characterize other British cities. In the City of London, there are very few elevated doorways surviving from before 1666, because almost all the buildings that would have carried them were destroyed. But the fire had a more indirect and more far-reaching effect on elevated doorways in British cities, because it changed the standards for commercial building construction in ways that influenced warehouse design throughout the country for the following 2 centuries. The primary lesson that the Great Fire taught to the builders who constructed the new city in its aftermath was that fire resistance required masonry construction. The medieval city had been built overwhelmingly in timber, with buildings so densely packed that a fire in one building could leap easily to its neighbours. The new regulations that followed the fire required brick or stone construction for new buildings in the city, limited the projection of upper floors over the street, which had allowed fires to spread from one side of the street to the other at upper floor level, and mandated firewalls between adjacent buildings. These regulations directly affected warehouse design. Medieval warehouses, including the wool and cloth warehouses of the provincial towns, had often been built in timber, with relatively light construction, because the cost of stone or brick was prohibitive. The post-fire regulations in London and the voluntary adoption of similar standards in other cities that had witnessed the catastrophic consequences of fire in densely built urban environments pushed warehouse construction toward brick and stone. The brick warehouse, thick walls, small windows, relatively heavy construction, was better suited to carrying the loads of stored goods than timber-framed construction, and it was also more amenable to the installation of iron hoist beams and heavy loading doors. The elevated loading door, in its most robust Victorian form, is largely a product of this shift to masonry construction. A heavy iron loading door, or a wide brick arch loading opening, requires a masonry wall to support it. The cast iron hoist to beam requires a masonry abutment and to anchor it. The masonry warehouse, developed in response to fire risk, created the structural conditions for the heavy-duty elevated loading door that became the standard form in the Industrial Revolution period. The Great Fire also had a less direct but equally significant effect through its impact on London's commercial geography. The destruction of the medieval city created an opportunity for rebuilding on a more rational plan, and while the grand schemes of Wren and others for a completely new street layout were never realised, the rebuilding did produce a commercial district with wider streets, more regularly planned blocks, and a cleaner spatial organisation than the medieval city had offered. This more rational commercial geography became, over the following century, the model for the planned commercial districts of the growing provincial cities. Manchester's commercial centre, laid out largely in the 18th and early 19th centuries, was planned with wide, straight streets designed to accommodate the heavy goods traffic that the growing textile trade required. The streets were designed from the beginning with the loading operations of adjacent warehouses in mind. They were wide enough for a loaded dray to manoeuvre, straight enough to allow direct access without the sharp turns that narrow medieval streets necessitated, and flanked by buildings with consistent floor-level heights that allowed standardized loading operations. This planned commercial geography was only possible because Manchester was growing from a relatively small medieval base and could organize its new commercial districts rationally. It drew, consciously or not, on the lessons of the London rebuilding after 1666. The influence of fire risk on elevated loading doors extends beyond the structural shift from timber to masonry. The specific concern with fire in warehouses that stored combustible goods, cotton, wool, tobacco, timber, led to the development of warehouse designs that incorporated fire isolation as a specific objective. Loading doors were fitted with iron shutters that could be closed in the event of a fire to prevent it spreading from one floor to another. Hoist shafts, the internal openings through which goods were raised from floor to floor, were lined with fire-resistant materials and fitted with self-closing doors. The loading bays at the front of buildings were designed so that the loading door, when closed, was as fire-resistant as the wall it was set into. These fire safety features added to the mass and complexity of the loading door, making it an even more substantial and permanent feature of the building than it would otherwise have been. The iron shutters, the heavy frames, the mechanical closing systems, all of these contributed to the physical robustness of the loading door as a feature, which is part of the reason why so many of them survive today in buildings that have been otherwise comprehensively altered. The relationship between fire risk, masonry construction, and elevated loading doors is most visible in the great warehouse districts of the Victorian industrial cities. But it has an earlier and less well-known chapter in the story of post-fire London's commercial precinct. The warehouses built in the City of London immediately after the Great Fire established the basic template for the masonry commercial warehouse with elevated loading access that would be repeated and elaborated over the following 2 centuries. They did so in a context of intense commercial pressure. London's merchants needed to get their businesses back in operation as quickly as possible after the fire, which produced buildings that were practical rather than experimental, functional rather than ambitious. The loading doors of the late 17th century City of London warehouses are straightforward, workmanlike features, wide enough to admit a barrel, strong enough to resist thieves, simple enough to be produced quickly by builders working at speed in a city undergoing massive reconstruction. Most of these post-fire warehouses are gone. The City of London has been redeveloped so many times since 1666 that the physical fabric of the immediate post-fire period is scarce. But enough survives in fragments, a section of warehoused frontage incorporated into a later building, a loading door frame reused in a subsequent structure, a hoist beam housing visible in the party wall, revealed by a later demolition to confirm that the pattern was established in the rebuilding of the 1670s and 1680s and carried forward into the major expansion of commercial warehouse building in the 18th and 19th centuries. A question that occurs to almost everyone who notices elevated doorways and begins to think about them seriously is, why are they so often at approximately the same height? If the height is determined by the specific functional requirements of specific buildings, the height of specific carts, the level of specific floods, the floor levels of specific rooms, then you would expect considerable variation in door heights from building to building and city to city. But while there is variation, there is also a remarkable degree of consistency, and the consistency is not accidental. The consistency has several sources, each of which operates at a different scale. At the smallest scale, the consistency within a single commercial district reflects the fact that the commercial district was designed to be used by a standardized fleet of vehicles. The horse-drawn dray or wagon that served Manchester's warehouse district was not a bespoke vehicle for each warehouse. It was a standard vehicle used by all the cartage contractors who operated in the city centre, and its bed height was standardized because standardization made operational efficiency possible. Every warehouse in the district needed to be able to load and unload standard drays without modification. The consequence was standard loading door heights across the district. At a slightly larger scale, the consistency across different cities in Britain reflects the fact that the standardization of vehicle dimensions was not just local, but national. Horse-drawn vehicles in Victorian Britain were not as standardized as modern motor vehicles. There was no legislation requiring uniform axle widths or bed heights, but the major cartage and haulage companies that operated nationally used vehicles built to fairly consistent specifications, because consistency reduced maintenance costs and simplified the training of drivers. The loading dock height at a Manchester warehouse needed to be usable by vehicles arriving from Liverpool or Leeds, as well as by locally based vehicles, and this requirement for interoperability drove convergence on standard heights. At the larger scale, the consistency across the entire history of loading door heights reflects the fact that the ultimate constraint, the size of a horse-drawn vehicle and the height of a working human being, was essentially constant for the entire period from the medieval period to the early 20th century. A working horse can pull a load up to a certain weight at a certain height. A human being is a certain height and can comfortably reach to a certain height above their head. The intersection of these biological constants with the practical requirements of loading heavy goods produces a consistent answer to the question of how high above the ground a loading door needs to be. The answer is approximately 2 to 3 meters, just high enough to allow a person to stand upright on the cart or boat below and manipulate the goods with comfortable reach, and just low enough not to require an excessively powerful mechanical system to raise the goods from ground level. This biological constant explains why loading door heights are similar not just across Britain, but across the Northern European commercial world. The warehouse loading doors of Amsterdam look remarkably similar to those of Bristol. The canal warehouse loading doors of the Low Countries look remarkably similar to those of Manchester. The merchant house loading doors of Hamburg look remarkably similar to those of York. They are similar because the vehicles, the workers, and the goods were similar, and the physical constraints that determined the optimal door height were consequently similar. The biological constant was modified, but not fundamentally altered, by changes in vehicle technology. The medieval cart, with its large wheels and relatively high bed, produced loading door heights at the upper end of the standard range, around 2.5 to 3 meters. The lower-wheeled Victorian dray, designed for urban cobblestone streets, produced loading door heights slightly below the medieval norm, around 2 to 2.5 meters. Canal boats, sitting lower in the water than road vehicles sit on the road, produced loading door heights at the lower end of the range, sometimes as low as 1.5 meters. Rail wagons, with their consistent standardized height, produced a very consistent loading dock height of around 1.25 meters. The practical consequence of this variation in vehicle heights is that, in a commercial district served by multiple transport technologies, road, canal, and rail simultaneously, as was common in many mid-Victorian industrial cities. There were multiple standard door heights in use at the same time. A building that was served by both road vehicles and canal boats would have two different loading door heights on its road-facing and canal-facing elevations. A building converted from canal side use to rail side use might have its original canal loading doors sealed and new doors at rail wagon height installed. The physical archaeology of these changes, sealed doorways at one height, new doorways at another, evidence of multiple phases of loading access, is one of the richest sources of information about the commercial history of Victorian industrial buildings. The flood door height standard, to the extent that one existed, was even more locally specific than the loading door standard. There is no universal flood height in the way that there is an approximate universal vehicle height. The flood level in York at a particular point on the Ouse was not the same as the flood level in Bristol at a particular point on the Avon, and the building response in each city was calibrated to local conditions rather than any external standard. But within a city, within a specific flood-prone district, there was a practical convergence on the known flood level, and buildings constructed in the same period in the same district would typically have their flood access at approximately the same height above the local street or waterway level. The consistency of elevated door heights within a given context, a given commercial district, a given flood-prone waterfront, is therefore both real and explicable. It is the result of standardization pressure operating at multiple scales, from the biological constants of horse and human, through the commercial pressures for operational interoperability, to the environmental realities of the local flood risk. Understanding where the consistency comes from allows you to understand both why the heights are consistent and why they are sometimes not, why some doors are higher than others, why the height changes across a district or along a waterfront, and what those changes tell you about the specific conditions that shaped the buildings that carry them. The height of 3 meters that this documentary uses as a reference point is not a precise standard. It is an approximation of the upper end of the normal range for road vehicle loading doors in the medieval and early modern period. In practice, elevated doors range from about 1.5 meters to 4 or more meters above the current street level, and within that range, the specific height carries specific information about the specific context: vehicle type, flood level, floor level, period of construction that produced it. The door at 3 meters is the average of a distribution, not a single datum. But the distribution has a shape, and the shape is not random. It clusters around the heights that made functional sense for the dominant loading technology of the period in which most surviving historic warehouses were built: the horse-drawn road vehicle of the 17th to 19th centuries. And it is that clustering that produces the impression, when you walk through an old British commercial district, that all the elevated doors are at approximately the same height. They are approximately at the same height. They are approximately at the height where cart met warehouse floor, where horse met building, where biological constant met commercial requirement over a period of several centuries of continuous use. The question of which elevated doorways survive and which have been lost is as instructive as the question of why the surviving ones are at the heights they are at. The survival rate is not random. It reflects specific patterns of demolition, conversion, protection, and neglect that have operated differently in different parts of Britain and in different types of urban environment. The cities that have retained the highest proportion of their elevated door heritage are, broadly speaking, those that experienced the least intensive redevelopment in the 20th century. This is not surprising in principle, but the specific pattern of what was redeveloped and what was not is revealing. The intensive city centre redevelopment that occurred in most British cities between the 1950s and the 1980s was primarily driven by two forces: bomb damage from the Second World War and commercial pressure for larger, more modern floor plates in the growing service economy. Cities that suffered extensive bomb damage, London, Coventry, Plymouth, Southampton, Bristol, Liverpool, lost large quantities of their pre-war building stock, including much of their warehouse heritage. Cities that were less extensively bombed but experienced intensive commercial development pressure in the 1960s and 1970s. Birmingham, Leeds, Sheffield lost much of their surviving historic fabric to the twin pressures of car-oriented planning and the demand for modern office and retail space. The cities that retained the most are consequently those that were spared both extensive bomb damage and intensive commercial redevelopment. York is the leading example. Relatively lightly bombed, the centre of a heritage tourism economy that provided positive incentives for conservation, and subject from the early 1970s to unusually stringent planning controls that prevented the demolition or unsympathetic alteration of historic buildings. Norwich is another, again relatively lightly bombed, with an economic history of decline in the post-industrial period that paradoxically preserved its building stock by reducing the commercial pressure for redevelopment. Chester, with its wall and its rows, was protected by its status as a tourist attraction from a relatively early date. Canterbury, with its cathedral and its medieval streetscape, was similarly protected. In both cases, the economic value of the historic environment as a tourism asset created a positive incentive for preservation that supplemented the regulatory protection provided by the planning system. The industrial cities that are most closely associated with the elevated loading door in its Victorian warehouse form, Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, Bradford, Sheffield, present a more complicated picture. All of them lost substantial quantities of their Victorian warehouse stock in the post-war redevelopment period. Manchester's northern quarter, which now presents itself as the city's most complete Victorian warehouse district, is a diminished remnant of what existed in 1939. The buildings that remain, remarkable in their own right, and the subject of growing conservation efforts, are the survivors of a process of attrition that destroyed a significant proportion of the original building stock. But the industrial cities are also the sites of some of the most significant conservation efforts of recent decades. The Albert Dock in Liverpool, which was derelict and threatened with demolition in the 1970s, was saved and converted in the 1980s in what became one of the defining projects of the urban regeneration era. Castlefield in Manchester, the first designated urban heritage park in England, was similarly rescued from dereliction. The canal-side warehouses of Leeds, the woolen mill complexes of Bradford, the cutlery workshops of Sheffield, all of these have seen substantial conservation and conversion activity in the last 30 years, transforming what were derelict industrial buildings into hotels, apartments, offices, and arts venues. The conservation and conversion of these buildings has preserved the external fabric, including the loading doors and hoist beams, in many cases. This is genuinely positive, but the conversion process has also, in many cases, removed the internal context that makes the external loading arrangements intelligible. A loading door that now opens onto a hotel corridor rather than a warehouse floor tells only half a story. The physical feature is preserved, but the operational context is gone. The most complete surviving examples of elevated loading door systems, where the door, the hoist mechanism, the internal floor arrangement, and the operational context are all still legible, tend to be in buildings that have had relatively minimal conversion work. Former warehouses that have been stabilized and perhaps partially conserved, but not comprehensively converted to new uses. There are examples of this type in several cities, typically in areas that have been scheduled or listed, but have not yet undergone comprehensive redevelopment. The tide of conversion has not entirely overwhelmed the most complete survivals. In some cases, active conservation efforts have deliberately preserved the loading mechanisms along with the loading doors. The collection of industrial heritage preserved at various sites around Britain. The Derwent Valley Mills World Heritage Site in Derbyshire, the Ironbridge Gorge Complex in Shropshire, the various preserved canal-side sites managed by the Canal and River Trust, include some excellent examples of elevated loading systems presented in their operational context. But these are showpiece examples, preserved and interpreted precisely because their significance was recognized. The thousands of less spectacular examples in ordinary commercial districts up and down the country. The single loading door on a former artisan workshop in a market town. The blocked-up flood door on the gable of a riverside house, the original ground floor entrance left in place, 3 meters above a street that has risen around it, are preserved if they are preserved at all, not because their significance is recognized, but because no one has yet had a reason to remove them. The fragility of this passive preservation, survival through inattention rather than through intentional conservation, is a matter of concern to those who study the historic built environment. Planning protection for listed buildings and conservation areas provides some security, but the coverage is not comprehensive. Many buildings with important elevated door features are not listed, and many conservation areas are drawn to protect streetscape character rather than the specific features of individual buildings. A building can be demolished or substantially altered within a conservation area if the planning authority is satisfied that the development contributes positively to the character of the area, and this standard does not provide specific protection for elevated loading doors or other features of commercial building archaeology. The situation is not hopeless. The growing interest in industrial heritage, the expansion of the listed building designation to cover a much wider range of industrial and commercial building types than was originally protected in the 1950s and 1960s, and the increasing sophistication of heritage impact assessment in the planning process have all contributed to better protection for elevated door features in recent decades. But the protection remains partial, the public awareness remains low, and the resources available for active conservation and interpretation are insufficient to address the full scale of the heritage. What is needed is not just better legal protection, but better understanding, a clearer public appreciation of what these features are, why they are significant, and what they tell us about the history of the cities we live in. The legal protection will follow the public understanding, as it always does. The understanding has to come first. Stand on King's Staithe in York on a grey morning, when the tourists have not yet arrived and the river is running high from recent rain upriver. Look at the buildings across the water. The elevated doors are there, as they have been for centuries, sitting in the walls of buildings that have survived everything, flood and fire and demolition and conversion, that the city has thrown at them over 500 or 600 years. Each one of those doors is an answer to a specific question. The question might have been, how high does the river get in a bad year? The question might have been, how high is a cart? The question might have been, what floor do I need to keep my goods on to keep them dry? And how do I get them there without carrying them up a narrow staircase? The question might have been, what level has the street reached now? And do I need to rebuild my entrance, or can I leave it where it has always been? Different questions, asked in different centuries, in different circumstances, by different people with different problems, but all of them answered in the same language. Brick and mortar, timber and iron, a door frame set into a wall at a specific height above a specific street, at a specific moment in the specific history of a specific city. The language of that answer is not difficult to learn. You do not need specialist training to read it. You need only to look at a building and ask, why is that there? Why is it at that height? What was happening in this street when this building was built? What was the water doing? What were the carts doing? What were the merchants carrying? And how did all of those things come together to produce this specific feature on this specific wall? When you start asking those questions, when you develop the habit of looking at old buildings not as backdrops to modern life, but as compressed records of the lives that shaped them, the city becomes a different kind of place. It is not just a collection of buildings. It is a document. It is a very long document, written by thousands of people over many centuries, and most of it has never been read. The doors, 3 meters off the ground, are the most visible pages of that document. They are right there, in plain sight, in every old city in Britain. Nobody will explain them to you, not in the depth they deserve. But now you know the shape of the explanation. You know that the height is not arbitrary. You know what questions the builders were answering. You know enough to read the door yourself. Go to York, go to Bristol, go to Norwich, to Chester, to Manchester, to Liverpool. Walk slowly, look at the walls, not the windows. Find the door 3 meters off the ground. Ask why. You already know how to start answering. Subscribe if this kind of history is what you came for. Every old city in Britain is full of features that nobody explains. We will keep explaining them.